The late Emanuel Steward was one of the greatest boxing trainers of all time. As a youngster, he competed as an amateur, winning the 1963 National Golden Gloves in the bantamweight division. He amassed a record of 94-3, although some sources say it was actually 97-3. So by all accounts, he was a very good amateur. He did plan to turn professional, but he had difficulty finding a manager to handle his career. His best managerial offer came from a California group, which included Eddie Futch. The offer required Steward to relocate to California, but he was still closely attached to his mother and his two younger sisters who still lived in Detroit. Subsequently, he decided to turn down the offer to remain close to his family. During the summer of 1969, Steward's 15-year-old half-brother, James Steward, left West Virginia and moved to Detroit to live with him. Shortly after his arrival, James asked Emanuel to teach him how to box. Emanuel had been out of boxing for some time, but he agreed to coach James. The two headed to the closest boxing gym, the Kronk Recreation Center, and after only 5 months of training, James won a Detroit Golden Gloves title. Steward became the head coach of the Kronk boxing program in 1971. Later that year, the Kronk Boxers won the team title at the Detroit Golden Gloves tournament. By the mid-1970s, Steward had built the Kronk into a national power in amateur boxing. Hill McKenty became Steward's first professional world champion when he knocked out Ernesto Espana in 9 rounds to win the WBA lightweight championship in March 1980. 5 months later, Thomas Hearns, the boxer with whom Steward is most closely associated, knocked out Pepino Cuevas in 2 rounds to win the WBA welterweight championship. For the next 30 years plus, Steward had a constant stable of champions. He trained 41 in total, several of whom he built from scratch. I remember a Manny Steward interview back in the 1990s in which he said that he didn't like to train heavyweights because most of them don't have any heart. I think it might have been on the Frank Bruno Rodolfo Marin card where he gave that interview. But regardless of that, he did train some heavyweights. For example, after guiding Michael Moorer to a world title at light heavyweight, he remained in his corner in the early stages of his heavyweight career. He later worked with Evander Holyfield for his rematch with Riddick Bowe. And in the latter stages of Steward's life, he helped resurrect the career of Vladimir Klitschko. But there was one heavyweight that Steward worked with who he described as his favorite, and that man was Lennox Lewis. In this video, I'll be reading excerpts from an interview that Manny gave several years before he passed away, in which he recounts what their working relationship was like and how it came about. I saw Lennox Lewis box on an amateur boxing show we had here in Michigan one time, maybe about 82 or something. He was a skinny, gangly kid. He was not that super well coordinated, but there was something about him that you could see then was different. He knew how to win fights. He may have been a little sloppy, but he did whatever he had to do to win. He was raised right here in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, which is only about 3 hours away from Detroit. So he would sometimes come to Michigan trying to get amateur fights back and forth when he was in the amateur program over there. He ended up representing Canada in the 1984 Olympics, and he lost to a fighter who I was training at the time for the Olympics, and that fighter was Tyrell Biggs. Rather than turn professional, he went back home and decided he wanted to wait and try again for the 88 Olympics. After the 88 Olympics arrived, he battled his way back until he got to the finals this time. He was still representing Canada, and what I was so impressed with that has stayed on my mind, really, whenever I think of Lennox, I think of this fight a lot more than I do any other fight in his career that I saw or have been a part of. It was when he realized that he waited 4 years and he was again losing to an American, this time Riddick Bowe. After the first round, he realized he was losing, and he did something that was typical of Lennox Lewis. He came storming out in the second round and just crushed Bo, and they had to stop the fight. He won his gold medal. Immediately after that fight, the first stop that he made was coming here to Detroit. I have the photograph still. He came to me to sign him to be his professional manager, and he came with a guy called John Hornewer, his attorney. I met him, showed him around my office, and we had dinner and discussed signing to a contract. I left and went out of town for a weekend. I had to go somewhere, so I put him in a nice hotel, and when I came back, my assistant, who was supposed to be spending some time with him, just left him alone. So he ended up catching a ride and going back to Canada, and that's how he ended up eventually getting hooked up with Frank Maloney and some other investment guys. They decided that it would be great for him, since he had been born in England, even though he had never boxed in England and didn't have that strong of a tie, that they would use his birthplace of England. That was because there was more money with the British pound than with the Canadian dollar. So that's why they decided to export his career and have him start fighting back in England. That's also why he never did get the full blessing or grace of the British fans, because he didn't represent them in the Olympics and things like they did with Frank Bruno and those types of guys. It took time for him to get the British people to really get behind him, but eventually it happened when he ended up knocking out Bruno and knocking out Mason and all those guys over there. Lennox Lewis would always do what he had to do to win. When Lennox fought Razor Ruddock, I was surprised by the quick knockout. But you know, once again it reminded me, I thought about it after. This is often what happens when you have a solid amateur background, which Lennox had, and Ruddock didn't have. But at the time, I was surprised at the quick knockout. I thought it was going to be a very tough fight. I don't remember, but I may have even picked Ruddock to win the fight between Lennox and him, because Lennox had had a few rough fights with Gary Mason and a few other guys over there, and he had never fought on the level that Ruddock had fought with Tyson and when he knocked out Michael Dokes and stuff. So I thought that Ruddock had a good chance of winning the fight, and I was somewhat surprised when Lennox knocked him out early. It was good, and in a way it was bad for Lennox, because at the time his whole camp just totally got dependent on the big right hand. Then they fought, I think, Phil Jackson before he fought Oliver McCall, and I was not that impressed in that fight because it was another fight where everything was about that big right hand. I think the Razor Ruddock fight was like a really big standout in his career in his mind, because even when I trained him, he was always wanting to get back to that weight that he had when he fought Razor Ruddock. And I told him that you can't, because you've grown a lot. At the time when Holyfield and Bo fought, if they had fought, I don't know myself. I think with all of the skill that Bo had, he still would have had a rough time with Lennox, because Lennox could change up from being a big guy that was a good boxer, and he could be a plain physical animal when he had to, and that's what he would do often because he was a very strong guy. You know, some guys may weigh the same, like Bo weighed the same as Lennox and a lot of other guys, but they didn't have the same density in their bones and their strength, and even the meanness that Lennox had. Lennox was a very mean person inside. According to several of Lennox Lewis's opponents and sparring partners, his physical strength was one of his greatest assets and one of his most surprising attributes. Not that you don't expect a guy who's 6'5" and 240 pounds plus to be strong, but compared to other guys of a similar size, Lewis was apparently even stronger than they were. I remember Shannon Briggs, after he fought Lewis, saying that he couldn't believe how strong Lennox Lewis was. And that's the thing that stood out to him more than anything else, more than Lewis's power, his speed, anything like that, his boxing skills. It was Lewis's physical strength. He said in the clinches, it was like running up against the brick wall when he fought Lennox Lewis. And many other fighters said the same thing or similar during Lewis's career. I remember one of his sparring partners, Ross Purity, who of course was it Ross Purity or Marion Wilson? It was one of those guys. But they also said they couldn't believe how strong Lennox Lewis was, just an incredibly physically strong man. And he used that. Lewis on the inside would lean on people. He would rough people up. Because unlike Klitschko, Lennox Lewis had an inside game, and I mean both Klitschkos. So Lewis could wrap you up and prevent you from fighting, smother you, but he could also fight with you. And normally when Lewis fought tall guys like Henry Akinwande, like Vitaly Klitschko, like Michael Grant, he was normally very aggressive. Even in his amateur days against very tall guys like James Oyabola, he was very aggressive. But there were some fights where even against short guys he was aggressive as a pro, like the Ray Mercer fight, for example. There was tremendous inside exchanges between those two in that fight.